I have to say I'm really excited to be here, and I can't wait to hear from our first panel. I know we have a tremendous amount of expertise on this panel and the other panels to follow. For me, it's sort of coming full circle being here. I came to Roger Williams for law school and was a Sea Grant Law Fellow and did the joint degree program with the University of Rhode Island. And back when I was in law school, it was actually when the offshore wind regulations were released under the Obama administration. And so as a law student, I very closely followed all of that and wrote my law review article on it. So it's just really exciting to see that this is a very hot topic right now, probably even more so than it was back then. And I think we're going to learn a lot. For our panel, as the first panel, our theme is setting the stage. So our goal is to provide sort of the lay of the land as far as the current regulatory framework that applies to offshore wind development in the US. We're also going to discuss how impacts and mitigation are addressed under the existing framework. You'll hear some examples about how the regulatory framework has limitations or, in some instances enables good evaluation of environmental impacts. And then I think it'll tee us up nicely for some discussions about whether net positive impacts on biodiversity can be connected to the mitigation hierarchy and regulatory framework that are in place. So to keep our intros brief, I'm just going to introduce each of our speakers, and then I'll hand it off for them to get started. Our format is that they're each going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll facilitate a dialogue among the panelists, and then reserve time at the end for audience Q&A. So our first speaker will be Amy Trice. She's the Senior Program Director at the Northeast Regional Ocean Council. Following Amy, we will hear from Ted Boling, who's actually on the phone, and Ted is a partner at Perkins Coie law firm, and he also has over 30 years of federal experience, previously serving as the general counsel for the Council on Environmental Quality and also as a deputy solicitor at Department of Interior. We will then hear from Becca Loomis, who's a project attorney in the Oceans Division at the Natural Resources Defense Council. After Becca, we'll hear from Matthew Eisenson, who's an associate research scholar for the Sabin Center at Columbia University. We will then get a federal perspective from Stephanie Vail-Muse, the regional energy coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Northeast region. And then last but not least, we will bring it home to Rhode Island with Grover Fugate, who served for 34 years as the former executive director of the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council, which implements the state's coastal management program. So without further ado, Amy, I will hand it over to you to get us started.
Hi, friends, colleagues. It's good to see people in person. It's been a really, really long time. Great to see some familiar faces. So today I'm going to set the stage for discussion on offshore wind and biodiversity by first starting with the current context, with the recognition that any of the net positive work that's going to be successful long term really has to be integrated into the current ocean and coastal management system. While we're thinking about working to push the envelope. So this is really about context setting. So the barriers to advance offshore wind and biodiversity targets include incomplete comprehensive planning and a need for increased permitting certainty, data gaps, ocean use conflicts, and of course, stakeholder and community challenges. There's also, in general, a the government approach to planning and permitting is still really evolving, and this is a new industry, new technologies, and then there's a big question around transmission and things like port infrastructure development. And we need effective rules, guidelines, science and monitoring, best practices and targets, that, I hope we'll really talk about in this symposium or nerd fest, however you all want to think about the next 2 days. I hope that we'll think about those different options on the table to really think about how we advance net gains for biodiversity. So just to give you a little bit of context, there's the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which for the first time set federal law with legal authorities for offshore wind renewable energy. This was under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And so this was really the first time that Congress essentially sort of bolted on this renewable energy concept to, in an oil and gas context. And so, we've learned a lot over time, and because this was new at the time, we didn't build in a lot of the things that I think are what's needed now to be successful, and that hopefully we can talk about over the next 2 days. But there was still a lot of uncertainty at the time. The law did not really fully account for all the needs related to renewable energy, and it didn't look at opportunities around things like best practices or sort of more comprehensive ocean planning approaches. And really the regulations governing offshore wind have been unchanged since 2009. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is actually in a draft renewable energy modernization rule right now. Comments are due, I think, May 1st. So if you've got thoughts on that, I'm sure that they would welcome those. But that is really, since 2009, that is really, this new rule will be the first time we've sort of worked to modernize. So over the next few slides, I'm really going to give you a discussion of a paper that I've done with my colleague Ted Boling, who will speak after me and go into a bit more detail. But this was a joint project with Ocean Conservancy and Perkins Coie, and so a lot of the recommendations that follow were really an effort to put forward policies and concepts that would help advance offshore renewable energy. And so just some context setting here of the purpose and sort of the space of what we're operating in now. The Biden administration, which I'm sure a lot of you know, has set a really ambitious target for offshore wind. That's 30 gigawatts by 2030. Many of the states, many of those in New England, have set also specific megawatt requirements related to renewable energy, and that's all to meet their climate mitigation goals. But what we know is that the current legal and regulatory tools are not really well designed for this really rapidly evolving industry and technology, and that threatens to stall progress on all of our climate mitigation targets. And so overcoming those challenges, we're really going to get to those multiple top-line priorities that we think about when we think about wind. That's climate mitigation, conservation goals that we'd like to achieve, equitable green jobs. To get at those, we think that these series of recommendations will help advance us towards that. So as I mentioned in the background, this was developed with legal and policy experts from Ocean Conservancy and Perkins Coie. And the author expertise really spans the federal government, permitting and NEPA, marine mammals and conservation, expertise on interagency coordination at the federal level, stakeholder engagement and regional ocean planning. And then we also talked to a bunch of people and got their perspective. And so there was experts on federal ocean policy, folks from federal agency staff, as well as various ocean users in the space. And so the recommendations were really aimed at the administration, federal agencies, and Congress. And I'll just say, I would encourage you to look at the document. There's a ton of recommendations in there, and I'm not going to go through all those today. But they kind of come around some various themes: advancing efficient permitting process, knowledge-based decision-making, early and consistent community engagement, coordination of federal agencies, particularly including things around transmission planning, programmatic and cumulative impact approaches, We also have some recommendations to Congress around revising the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act with a renewable energy title specific for offshore wind to kind of get at some of those needs I mentioned earlier. And then one that is ambitious, but I think particularly in the context of biodiversity and net positive, is a comprehensive ocean statute that is comparable to public lands. And that could provide the basis for landscape scale conservation as well as a sort of more robust renewable energy program. And then we target a lot of different agencies with this. Keep in mind that I think a lot of the discussion today will be around BOEM and the permitting process, but there are tons of different federal agencies that are involved in advancing offshore wind. And so, you know, these recommendations target a lot of these different agencies. So that would be the Department of Interior, BOEM, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Department of Defense Siting Clearinghouse, the White House Interagency Ocean Policy Committee, as well as the Permitting Council. And this is just to sort of give you an example. I think you will see this a lot through the next 2 days. This is the BOEM permitting process, and I'm sort of bringing this to your attention mainly just to orient you a bit, but also the recommendations that we include in the report go into, they're color-coded depending on where you are in the BOEM process. And so I'm not going to go through all of these individual recommendations. I'll just say the ones that are sort of I've boxed in pink are ones that I think, as we start thinking about biodiversity, positive and net benefits and those types of things, there's a base of work to start from. There has been a lot of thinking around these concepts, and there are some that I think we could pull from when we think about things like site identification, BOEM rulemaking, multi-factor bidding. All of those types of things are things that we could look to as we try to progress this discussion. Other things on the permitting itself around review procedures, programmatic and cumulative effects review, and then lastly on the construction and operation phase, issues around regulatory compliance, how do we integrate new and advanced technologies that maybe benefit wildlife, and then lastly on sort of the congressional side, the two that I mentioned earlier, the Renewable Energy OXLA title, as well as the Comprehensive Ocean Statute. So lastly, you know, I now work at the Northeast Regional Ocean Council, so I want to highlight a couple of things here. Firstly, the Northeast Regional Ocean Council is a state-federal partnership, and working in New England that has all the New England states and all the federal agencies at the table. So I think as this discussion continues, thinking about how to bring in, you know, using NROC as a convener to discuss biodiversity is really important. And then my colleague, Emily Shimshinia, was going to speak later I think tomorrow afternoon, on the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative. I think that is a particularly important area where you've got developers, states, feds, and conservation groups all at the table making decisions about science and regional research. And when we think about adaptive management and the need for data and information to make more informed decisions, the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative is obviously a great place to look. And then I just want to sort of give you all a little bit of maps and things to look at here as well. The Northeast Regional Ocean Data Portal is run by NROC. This is a new map that has sort of the proposed sites for turbines and power cables, substations that are now also available, and there are tons of maps also on marine life and fish and other ocean uses as well. And there's also a new one related to the Coast Guard Port Access Route Study and sort of the new uses there. And so I'm really saying all this and showing you these maps to say that it's important to look at all the different activity and uses that are happening out in the ocean space. And as we think about biodiversity and net positive, I would really encourage people to familiarize themselves with the various types of leases and activity that is out there. Familiarize yourself with the various legal, the laws. It's beyond the BOEM permitting process. There are tons of state and federal laws that govern all of this work offshore. And if we are going to actually make positive biodiversity impacts, we have to look beyond just the BOEM permitting process to be successful. And I think it would be important for people to really understand what's happening offshore. And I think the data portal is a great place to go to find that. I will leave it there for now and wait until we get more questions from the audience, but and pass it along to Ted, who I'm hoping is online. And so Ted's going to really dig in more on the substance a bit, on some of the permitting, and great to have you, Ted.
All right. Great to be working with you again, Amy, and congratulations on your new position. So I'm going to rip through 18 slides that are going to do a bit of a deeper dive onto what Amy just gave you the high-level overview, and I'm also, following the BOEM color code for its process. And first of all, if we can go to next slide, please. So BOEM is following the ambitious goals of the Biden administration, and as outlined by Secretary Haaland, at a vigorous pace. I mean, we have New York Bight wind auction with a record-setting $4.3 billion in leases. These leases basically give you the right to go out and develop a construction and operation plan. So it's a lot of money to spend on the hope that BOEM will support you. Then followed on by lease sales in North Carolina, off the coast of California in December of last year. And then marching forward this year, we've got a proposed sale notice for within wind energy areas off the coast of Texas and Louisiana. And then plans to do the same leasing off the coast, off the central Atlantic, so farther out than the current lease off the coast of Virginia, and then in Oregon, and then moving on into the Gulf of Maine is sometime in 2024. Next slide, please. So as Amy's noted, the authority for all this activity was basically bolted on in a rather obtuse kind of way. I mean, it doesn't actually talk about wind power, renewable energy generation. It talks about energy from sources other than oil and gas. But there's authority in OXLA, and if you can go to the next slide, please. What it provides for is basically the authority to competitively lease, and competition is really the key here. You have to have a valid auction or a determination of no competitive interest, and providing for leases that, amongst other things, need to balance interests, including safety, environmental protection, the prevention of waste, which in the wind context would be, the prevention of, the waste of wind, fair return to the U.S. government, protection of national security interests, so those are the DoD interests that come into play, and prevention of interference with reasonable uses of the ocean, and consideration of other uses, including fishery uses. Next slide, please. The process that leads you to this massive investment in infrastructure out in the outer continental shelf is a deliberate, painstaking, more or less along this timeline of a couple years of environmental analysis that Bureau of Ocean Energy Management under Secretary Ken Salazar and his Smart from the Start program set up a bunch of intergovernmental task forces, generally sort of state-oriented, and did requests for interest and call for nominations to figure out, who is interested in actually, buying these leases, as well as also undertaking the environmental reviews that have to, it's typically at the environmental assessment level, but are part of supporting a leasing stage. And so all of the leases are offered with a proposed sale notice and then comments on that, a final sale notice, supported by an environmental assessment. The environmental assessment's fairly limited. It's looking at the effects of going out and doing the site assessment, which follows on. And that's generally over a 2 to 5 year period, as originally envisioned by the 2009 regulations. We were imagining, they'd have Met towers built out there and some fairly intrusive surveying, and over time that's changed. The modernization rule, which Amy noted, has a comment period closing in beginning in May, seeks to update those regulations because they were built largely on a sort of oil and gas model as applied to theoretically offshore wind. But what the outcome of that site assessment process gives you the opportunity to do is propose a construction operation plan over which the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has basically plenary authority. They can approve it, deny it, or modify it. And frankly, there's a lot of latitude potentially there in terms of modification. And they are doing environmental impact statements for those construction operation plans. One question would be, when they will adopt, maybe we'll have enough experience under our belt that BOEM thinks that it could do just an environmental assessment at that level. But delving down a bit deeper into this, if we can go to the next slide, please. And here I'm just gonna accelerate. All right, so we said, they've used this intergovernmental task force. They've also used the identification of wind energy areas. And that is sort of the focal point. Some degree of deconfliction that occurs before, but that's sort of the focal point for NEPA analysis, for alternatives analysis, and leases tend to be sort of carved out, a subset of those wind energy areas. In the New York Bight, I think it was about, the lease area was actually at about like 22% of the total wind energy areas that were evaluated. And then they've typically gone through competitive lease auctions. There is the potential for unsolicited lease requests. There have been examples of that on the West Coast for floating wind technology. But that, the industry has matured to the point where it's a little hard to imagine we're going to have an unsolicited lease at this point. Next slide, please. So this lease issuance proceeds on sort of a parallel path of, you've got a proposed sale notice and then a final sale notice, and then, the NEPA review going along with that. And you have also some degree of consultation under other statutes. Endangered Species Act, Essential Fish Habitat Considerations under Magnuson Act, and, Historic Preservation, CCMA, but it's a fairly coarse level of review. Because we're going to proceed on quickly to next slide, to the lease auction. The lease auctions, as they have evolved, have gone from just a pure price auction, which was what we called the bidding bonanza back in 2018 in the Trump administration, to more of a hybrid lease with multiple factors considered in there. The first leases offered during the Obama administration, including the Vineyard Wind lease, had provisions in there for some credit if you had community benefit agreements, which are basically arrangements for the parts of the community that be affected by the project, or power purchase agreement. And so Vineyard obtained credit for that. And the Biden administration has resumed that practice of providing credits for considerations such as the benefits to supply chain development. You're going to have a project labor agreement. Are you going to, in California, it adopted provisions for lease area use agreements, which is a sort of complicated way of saying we have an agreement with, say, like the fishing community. And frankly, that mechanism of multi-factor auction bidding could evolve even further in Oregon and the Gulf of Maine to include other factors, including biodiversity factors. Moving along, next slide, please. As I noted, over time, the assessment of these leases has grown less intrusive. Use of LiDAR, remote sensing technology, and Boeing is actually proposing to just strip away the references to Met towers. If you're going to use a Met tower, then well, you're in a different world now. It's these buoys are how we collect data, that, and also remote operated vehicles and surveys, which tend to be much less intrusive. Next slide. So as I said, I mean, site characterization, we're doing geophysical work, the geotechnical work, but the geotechnical work, ideally can be fairly limited. There was this thinking that, well, Boeing wanted to know exactly micrositing every particular turbine and monopile location. Through experience has found that really they need to adopt more of a project design envelope approach with some degree of flexibility for the micrositing and defer some of the actual site-specific determinations to the final design review. As I note, that there's a real price to investing heavily in boreholes and vibrocores, for exact evaluation of the subsurface at that stage. You want to maintain some flexibility to respond to comments. And then moving on to the next slide, please. The comments would be focused on your construction and operation plan, which is a very detailed document with its geological reports. I mean, it's just a full survey of interests of the effects of the project from how are you going to manage waste? How are you going to manage your, the boat traffic, the construction phase? What are the water quality impacts, the socioeconomic impacts, the full range? And every agency that's involved in the permitting process is going to have some interest in that aspect. Moving on to the next slide, please. As I noted, Boeing, towards the end of the Obama administration, adopted from Europe, from the UK, the project design envelope approach, which was sort of a maximum case scenario approach, sort of setting the outer bounds within which the developer would have some degree of freedom to make micro adjustments, but the environmental analysis would be reasonable and realistic. But consider a range of options, a range of impacts there. Moving on to the next slide, please. So the review of this construction operation plan is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the lead agency. Of course, BOEM has to consult under the Endangered Species Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Act for Essential Fish Habitat, the Historic Preservation Act, CZMA, and of course you've got MMPA requirements as well. And then there's informal consultation with agencies with equities, such as, of course, Coast Guard for navigation, DoD for national security interests, because they're, DoD has been training in a lot of these waters for a long time and would like to continue to do so. And then you have other permits and other authorizations that ideally are coordinated with and make use of the same environmental review. If you've got an air permit, EPA has jurisdiction in the Outer Continental Shelf. Or, of course, the Army Corps of Engineers under Clean Water Act and Rivers and Harbors Act, National Marine Fisheries Service, of course, addressing the effect on marine mammals, and then the FAA. So it's a crazy quilt of next slide, please, of authorities that come to bear here. With I've listed them here, and then it's not just federal agencies, of course, state agencies, the tribes. I mean, their interests ideally are addressed throughout this process, and such that we can arrive at a construction operation plan that would actually be feasible to implement and not run headlong into the objections of another jurisdictional agency. And at the top of all this, next slide, please. Most every one of these projects has taken advantage of what might pejoratively be referred to as a sort of NEPA streamlining and the FAST Act. FAST does not stand for fast in the common sense. It stands for Fixing America's Surface Transportation. And Title 41 of the FAST Act was basically a convenient vehicle for Senators Portman and McCaskill to bolt on their permitting efficiency provisions, which are actually not in Title 23, the transportation title, but attached to NEPA, Title 42, where it basically codified the Obama administration executive order-based interagency coordination for infrastructure development. Title 41 is much broader than just offshore wind, but it seems to be particularly focused on offshore wind nowadays, both by virtue of the administration's goals for offshore wind and just the convenience of it as a vehicle. Next slide, please. To use the permitting dashboard as a means of coordinating all these milestones and make sure that all these sort of jurisdictional pots come up to boil at the same time. And then the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, made a few modifications to Title 41. One concern with Title 41 was it was originally set to sunset in December of 2022. The Biden administration made sure that didn't happen, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act sort of strengthened many of the IIJA provisions, sort of tightening up some of the timeframes for agencies to get their interagency coordination game together, and particularly the use of a coordinated project plan at the outset to sort of lay out, here's our game plan for running the permitting process, not just the NEPA process, but all authorizations associated with an infrastructure project. Next slide, please. So our current state of play, we generally are operating on presumptively a 2-year time frame from the notice of intent to issue an environmental impact statement through all the gates of the scoping process and production of environmental impact statements to the preparation of a record decision. The current rules provide for transparency on what is our timeline. In reality, in other words, that it's adapted to the needs and exigencies of particular projects and also just the available agency capacity. And there's a mechanism for senior agency officials to provide for a right-sized timeline. So 2 years should not be considered a lockstep, but there are some points in the process for familiar for public review and such, and then a heavy lean in on the use of scoping before the public issuance of a notice of intent, really, gathering agencies and efforts together. So that's what I've got for you right now. And next slide, please. Of course, we're going to defer until the end of the presentation for next slide for questions. So I'll leave you with my picture of the Block Island Wind Farm and Becca.
Thanks, Ted. We're going to hand it off to Becca now.
Great. Thank you. My name is Becca Loomis. I am an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into a few of the processes that Ted introduced us to. And these concern area identification or wind area selection, and also the lease sale auction process. And part of the reason I'm focusing on these early areas in the offshore wind planning process is because the earlier you implement mitigation and efforts at having net positive impacts on biodiversity, potentially the more effective these measures can be. Once a site is selected, you kind of go down this dependent pathway, and the farther in the process you get, the more limitations there are on changes you can make and the extent to which you can be creative with mitigation and addressing impacts. So that's why we're focusing. That's why I'm focusing on kind of these earlier stages. So just a little framing for our discussion. As Ted said, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act authorizes the government to issue leases for offshore wind development. Any offshore wind or renewable energy activities on the Outer Continental Shelf must provide for protection of the environment. And BOEM and lessees are required to apply the mitigation hierarchy really at all stages of offshore wind planning and development. The mitigation hierarchy is to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts. And the regulations require considerations of the mitigation hierarchy from area identification to lease issuance to construction and operations. So it's important to kind of in my understanding, having a net positive impact on biodiversity offers the opportunity to add further ecosystem benefits, but it doesn't take the place or it can't supersede requirements for mitigation that already exist. So you have to address adverse impacts from development, I think, before you can start to look at net positive or net gain. So I'm showing this BOEM timeline once again. I'm first going to talk about the area identification process, which I highlighted with that red arrow. And BOEM considers a lot of information when honing down a larger call area into a wind energy area, which are ultimately these locations that are likely suitable for offshore wind leasing and development. BOEM consults with other federal agencies, state and local governments. They get input from stakeholders. They look at environmental information, and there's other sources of information that are taken into account. But I'm going to focus on one particular procedure that the agency has used in a few recent area identification efforts in the Gulf of Mexico and the Central Atlantic region. And this is the NCOS model. NCOS stands for the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. It's a subsection of NOAA. And NOAA's NCOS office developed this modeling tool, which has been used in offshore wind, aquaculture, and a few other areas. And this tool is designed to look at the available spatial data in a larger region, assign suitability scores to a variety of different factors, and then sort of statistically determine which areas within this region are the most suitable for infrastructure such as offshore wind. So as you can see from this wedge diagram, the NCOS model considers data from 6 or 7 different categories. So this is the model used for the Gulf of Mexico. In the Central Atlantic modeling, they actually consolidated economics and logistics. But essentially, there's over 50 different data layers, each of which represents a different variable that speaks to suitability. So for example, under natural resources, you have protected species and ecologically significant habitat. And under economics and logistics, you have things like wind speed, distance to port, and industry interest. So things that make an area favorable for development. The BOEM, and sometimes in consultation with other agencies, assigns a suitability score to each of these variables, and then essentially, they calculate an average across the variables within one of these submodels, the wedges, and then they calculate an average across all of the submodels. So essentially, for each 10-acre area within a larger region, the outcome is a suitability score that represents sort of all these different categories, the way that all these different categories impact the suitability of an area. And then they perform a cluster analysis to find areas that are larger than 10 acres that are grouped together. So for example, in the this is the Gulf of Mexico, and these are the identified wind energy areas. And so this was basically the outcome of the NCOS model. BOEM also releases, or at least they have in the 2 times they've used the NCOS model, they release a report detailing their methodology and detailing their results and conclusions. And they've invited stakeholder comment on the NCOS model outcome. And we definitely support this. I mean, increased transparency and stakeholder input in siting is pretty much always a good thing. So in the Gulf of Mexico, they ended up narrowing down from the series of potential wind energy areas, and they ultimately offered the 2 that I circled, or they're going to offer the 2 that I circled for lease. They made some minor modifications based on stakeholder and agency input. So that brings me to sort of the open question, which is whether NCOS modeling can inform NPI, net positive impact on biodiversity efforts. There's a few challenges. So first, the NCOS model only looks at available data. And in a lot of cases, we're still collecting information on species that are impacted, how they're impacted, and if the data doesn't exist, then it doesn't go in the model. So it's really important to have an understanding that there are knowledge gaps inherent in the use of this modeling tool. The second challenge is that the NCOS modeling tool lacks detail as to the nature of impacts, so how offshore wind would affect a protected species, for example. It looks more to the presence of that species and the vulnerability of that species, but it doesn't really detail how they would be impacted. That's something that we see more in NEPA analysis, and an EIS happens later in the stages of offshore wind development, as Ted said, and my co-panelist Matt is going to talk a little bit more about the EIS process, so you can think about maybe comparisons between the different ways of doing review. And then finally, the NCOS model doesn't consider construction and operation impacts. It's limited to site characterization. And this is a shortcoming for sure, because once you identify your areas that will be leased, that's where construction and operation is going to occur, right? And there are a lot of impacts that we see from those. Nevertheless, NCOS information could be used to advise NPI if the process is sort of expanded upon, impacts are considered in more detail, and construction and operations impacts are integrated into this process. It could be a tool for NPI, and I think particularly for designing legally binding lease stipulations. And this occurs prior to the lease sale process around the same time. So it's a good opportunity to gather information for lease stipulations. Second, I'm going to talk about the lease sale auction process, and specifically I'm going to go into some detail about multiple factor auctions. Again, this is something that Ted introduced, and I'm just going to kind of go a little deeper and provide some more detail. So looking at this timeline once again, you can see the red arrow pointing out where in the whole process lease sale auctions occur. So multiple factor auction, so in a typical, in a traditional auction, right, bidders submit monetary bids, and the highest bid wins, and gets the lease essentially. So multiple factor auctions are a procedure that's used by BOEM, and they're actually sort of codifying it more in the new the Renewable Energy Modernization Rule, this new rule that's currently that BOEM is currently seeking comment on. Multiple factor auctions include both a monetary factor, which is just a monetary bid, it's an amount of money, and then not one or more non-monetary factors. And these are things that basically support or advance public policy objectives related to offshore wind development. So when a company is participating in a multiple factor auction, they can get credit towards their bid for satisfying the criteria for one of these public policy objectives or non-monetary factors. And essentially, they put either a portion of money directly to one of these policy objectives, or they can satisfy the bidding criteria by entering into an agreement, like a community benefit agreement or a power purchase agreement. And then by doing so, they're awarded a credit in the auction, and so they essentially, their monetary bid is lower, but they get credit for submitting a higher bid. So this is a way of sort of financially incentivizing bidders and ultimately lessees to support objectives like advancing the supply chain, contributing to workforce training, or, like I said, entering into community benefit agreements. Just as an example of a recent multiple factor auction that used a non-monetary factor, the Pacific Wind lease sale, which was a lease sale for areas offshore California, included a 5% credit for either executing a community benefit agreement or having a strategy to do so, so a concrete strategy to do so. And BOEM essentially assesses these strategies in advance of the lease sale to determine whether they fulfill the criteria, whether the bidder has an actual sort of concrete strategy, has a strategy for identifying impacted communities, strategies for mitigation, and mechanisms for collaboration or issue resolution. And if BOEM approves of the strategy, then the bidder will know in advance of the lease sale auction that they qualify for this 5% credit. And the credits range from 5% to 25% has been used, I think 20 or 25 for things like supply chain and workforce training. So there's some open questions around the extent to which multiple factor auctions can be used to advance NPI. So first, it's important to remember that any NPI strategies really have to be additional. They have to go above and beyond addressing adverse impacts. That's really mitigation, right? And so multiple factor auction credits, they can't replace mitigation that's required in lease stipulations. They have to go above and beyond that. Additionally, strategies that receive credit, they have to be demonstrated to be effective, right? It's illogical. It doesn't really make sense to award credits to bidders for a strategy that's not going to help address, help further a net positive impact on biodiversity. And similarly, you could use multiple factor auctions to address adverse impacts as well, but it'd have to be through a different mechanism. And then finally, strategies have to be enforceable over the long term. So currently, BOEM takes a strategy of requiring lessees to repay the value of the credit if they fail to follow through on whatever the conditions of that credit were. But we haven't basically gotten far enough in any of the wind development project processes to see if this happens. It's unclear whether this is an inadequate remedy, and it's unclear who is monitoring to make sure that these benefits accrue. So two of the big open questions around using multiple factor auctions to address NPI are who is going to sort of vet and verify strategies to determine their efficacy, and who's going to enforce them over the long term. Just to wrap up, I think it's possible, for sure, to adjust the site identification and the leasing auction procedures to incorporate and try to implement NPI strategies. But again, these strategies really have to go beyond the mitigation hierarchy, and the mitigation hierarchy has to be satisfied first. And as I said, there's really some open questions around how these would be implemented. So yeah, hopefully this gives folks some good food for thought, and we can discuss some of these strategies further. Thanks. And I'm going to invite Matt up.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Eisenson. I'm a fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. At the center, I run the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative, and we do two main things. We have a research function. We do research on obstacles to siting renewable energy facilities. And then we also provide direct representation to individuals and communities who support renewable energy facilities. We don't initiate lawsuits, but we do intervene in siting disputes, and we file amicus briefs. So you've heard from the first three panelists about the general regulatory process from beginning to end, and a deeper dive into the early stages. I'm going to be focusing on the last stage of environmental review. This is the environmental impact statement that BOEM prepares on the construction and operations plan that the developer submits. Why are we focusing on this? One is that it's the federal government's last major opportunity to assess environmental impacts before approving a project. And two, it's the subject of a lot of litigation. If you look at, we'll talk about this in more depth, but if you look at Vineyard Wind, there are currently 4 NEPA lawsuits against the project. And these are lawsuits filed by opponents of a project against the federal government, alleging that the environmental analysis in the environmental impact statement was inadequate. Almost always the developer will intervene and participate, but they're initiated as lawsuits against the federal government. And these 4 NEPA lawsuits against Vineyard Wind, you'll notice none of them is brought by a traditional environmental group, one by a solar developer, one by a local resident group in Nantucket, and two by the fishing industry. So, quick outline of what we'll cover here in this presentation. First, we'll talk about what is an environmental impact statement, how does it fit into the permitting process. Second, how are species and habitat risks evaluated in the EIS? And how does this analysis inform agency decision-making? Third, we'll talk about how these environmental impact statements are being challenged in court. And last, we'll talk about how the NEPA process can potentially be improved to better achieve net positive impact. So an EIS is the more detailed form of environmental analysis. An EIS is required for any major federal action that can significantly affect the quality of the human environment. And here, the major federal action is BOEM's approval of the construction and operations plan submitted by the developer. And what goes into an EIS? The NEPA requires that for any major federal action that significantly affects the quality of the environment, the federal government needs to prepare a detailed statement that addresses a few things. First, environmental impacts of the proposed action. Second, any adverse impacts that cannot be avoided if the action is implemented. And third, reasonable alternatives to the proposed action. And as I mentioned, this is the major federal action here is the approval of the construction and operations plan at the end of the process. So a really important question is, how detailed does an EIS need to be? And this is really important because a typical NEPA lawsuit will allege that the environmental impact statement is deficient in some way because it doesn't provide adequate consideration of one type of environmental impact or another, or doesn't provide adequate range of alternatives. So NEPA gives sort of mixed messaging on this. If you look at the NEPA regs, on the one hand, NEPA requires that the agency provide a full and fair discussion of significant environmental impacts, which suggests, rather lengthy and comprehensive document, full and fair discussion. On the other hand, the regs are explicit that these documents should not be encyclopedic, it should not be longer than necessary, and that they should only address impacts in proportion to their significance. But it's open-ended enough that it's very difficult to defeat a NEPA action on a motion to dismiss. There's a fair amount of interpretation on what needs to go into an environmental impact statement and what doesn't. The courts have interpreted NEPA as requiring that agencies take a hard look. And one very important thing to understand is that it doesn't mandate a particular outcome. It just requires that agencies consider all these impacts, consider a wide range of alternatives, or a reasonable range of alternatives. Now, the question, how are these risks evaluated? NEPA, in a typical environmental impact statement, will look at a range of different types of impacts. There will be a section on marine mammal impacts, a section on visual impacts, one on greenhouse gas impacts. And they'll compare the proposed action to a no action alternative, which is what happens if we don't do anything at all, and then compare it to some other alternatives. And the other alternatives will often be like, the developer will want to construct 100 turbines, but one alternative might be, what would it look like if we did 90 instead? Or what would it look like if we, increase the spacing among the turbines? For some of these impacts, it's a lot easier looking at the summary charts like this to decide, what's better, the proposed action or the no action alternative. I pulled a few up here. Air quality. This is largely greenhouse gas analysis. It's very straightforward that constructing offshore wind has better air quality impacts than the no action alternative, which is keeping fossil fuel plants in operation. It's a lot more. It's a lot harder to compare for some things like marine mammal impacts, where it's sort of an apples and oranges comparison. And I'll show you how this looks in practice. So if you look at the marine mammals chapter of an environmental impact statement, and this is the draft environmental impact statement for Empire Wind, you'll have analysis of climate change impacts on the one hand, how climate change under the no action alternative would affect marine mammals by affecting the food supply, how storms would affect, whale fitness. And then on the other hand, for the proposed action, BOEM looks at, will there be any incremental impacts from, increased vessel traffic or any risk of entanglement. And ultimately, it's just not quite straight as forward as the section on greenhouse gas impacts, which, for Empire Wind, the federal government found that the total, cost of all of the emissions, the social cost of all of the emissions from construction, operations, and decommissioning would be about $20 million compared to a, nearly $1 billion benefit, and that's with a 5% discount rate. So the environmental impact statement for Empire Wind, the BOEM explicitly states that all of the emissions from constructing, operating, decommissioning this facility would be offset within 3 months of operation. There's no, similarly explicit statement comparing the no action alternative to the proposed action for marine mammals. So how are these things being challenged in court? I mentioned at the beginning that there are 4 NEPA challenges against Vineyard Wind. And I mentioned that they're not, brought by your typical environmental groups. I think we can talk a little bit more in the discussion about community impact. But I think it's important to understand here that with Vineyard Wind, the developer entered into host community agreements long before any of this happened. There's an agreement with the town and county of Nantucket not to site any turbines any closer than those in the original plan. The developer also entered into an agreement with Conservation Law Foundation and NRDC to limit vessel speeds and limit drilling to certain months. So by the time you get to this very last stage, many of the environmental groups and local communities, local governments are on board, and you have these challenges by sort of atypical NEPA plaintiffs. We won't go deep into the individual lawsuits, but they're interesting. A common thread through all of these lawsuits is that they all focus on marine mammal impacts, whether it's the solar developers lawsuit, fishing industry lawsuit. So we have a lawsuit by a solar developer, and it alleges both competitive harms to the solar business and also marine mammal impacts. I mentioned earlier that one of the big questions about NEPA is how much analysis do you need? One of the arguments here is that the analysis of the no action alternative for greenhouse gas impacts was not sufficient because the federal government was essentially saying, if this offshore wind project is not built, we're going to keep using fossil fuels. But actually, the federal government, according to the plaintiff here, should have been modeling what would happen if the onshore solar were built instead. This complaint also has allegations about marine mammals, including here insufficient consideration of acoustic impact of wind turbine generators. The focus is often on acoustic impact during the pile driving phase. We also have this is one of the lawsuits brought by a fishing industry group. Fishing industry here is essentially fighting against the idea that the EIS should only address the contents of the construction and operations plan. If you read the complaint in the summary judgment briefing, what you see is that the fishing industry is saying that the federal government should have considered alternatives outside of the leasing area, and that there should have been a full-scale environmental impact statement much earlier in the process over there at the leasing stage. And the federal government's response to that is, well, the lease doesn't give a developer permission to actually build a wind project. It just gives the developer permission to do studies, site assessment activities, which are a lot less disruptive and don't require this full-length analysis. As to potential improvements to the NEPA process, I think it's challenging, but the question for me is whether it's possible for the agencies to do more of an apples-to-apples analysis rather than apples to oranges. With the greenhouse gas impacts, it's just so clear which is preferable, the proposed action or the no action alternative. And with marine mammals, the question is whether the agency should be doing more synthesis and analysis instead of just describing a lot of different impacts. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Next, we will hear from Stephanie.
All right. Hey, y'all. So I am Stephanie Vail-Muse. I'm the Regional Energy Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Northeast Region. And I'm basically going to be talking to y'all about offshore wind, compensatory mitigation, what it looks like for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and net positive impact projects, or at least the hypothetical ones, because we don't have any yet. All right, so what are the drivers for Fish and Wildlife Service consultations? Why is industry coming to us? Well, basically, it's part of the process to get a project leased on the outer continental shelf. And there's several relevant federal laws and executive orders, right? I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because you guys can look at it. But basically, what we're looking for is when industry comes to us, the earlier in the process you come, the better and the more streamlined the consultation process is. Because once we get into the consultation timeline for the Endangered Species Act, which is roughly 135 days if we go formal, we're on the clock. So the number of conversations that we can have about avoidance, minimization, mitigation, and then compensatory mitigation becomes very constrained. So we want to be as early in the consultation process, right, preferably before we even enter the consultation process as we possibly can for these types of conversations. The whole point is that by the time that you enter your consultation, or industry enters the consultation, there really shouldn't be any surprises. We should have a pretty good understanding of what you're going to do out there, the type of project you're going to be implementing, the proposed action, and it just makes it so much easier for everybody, for industry, for state partners, for us, if we're just having really early conversations. And the benefits of this is that we can talk to you, we can talk to industry, we can talk to anybody who's out there who's interested in these projects about what's effective, what's working, what we're concerned about. So step one of the mitigation hierarchy for us is always going to be to avoid. All right, that is the most beneficial thing that you can do, is to just avoid the impact to the trust resource, to the species. Then, if you cannot avoid it, if it cannot be avoided, then to minimize that impact. And those are all, as just part of the consultation process, those are all things that happen in face-to-face conversations or potentially virtual conversations right now. But it really does mean that we're sitting at the table and we're talking, because that's what a consultation is. A consultation is two people having a conversation with each other about what's out there in the environment, what we're concerned about, what we know, what we don't know. And in the offshore wind environment, especially for our non-listed birds, there's a lot of questions. So when you're looking at this, when you're thinking about the mitigation hierarchy, when you're thinking about net positive projects and compensatory mitigation, you have to start the whole thought process with, how do I avoid the impact to start with? If I can't do that, then how do I mitigate it? And if I can't do that, then we're having a compensatory mitigation conversation. The thing about the service is that we're currently working under a no net loss policy instead of a net benefit policy. And I think this is where industry has a really fantastic opportunity to help us. Because industry's net benefit projects, that means you're going above and beyond no net loss. Right? If our baseline is 20 birds, they're not going to just try and put out 20 birds. They're going to try and potentially propagate 40 birds, right? They're making more than what was originally out there. And that is something that takes planning. It takes time. It takes a lot of conversations. And if you're doing it at a landscape scale, which is what is going to be the most beneficial for the resource, for the species, then there's a lot of planning that's involved in that. So for us, for the Fish and Wildlife Service specifically, when you're thinking about net positive, when you're thinking about benefits, you really also need to be thinking about early conversations, lots of planning, and a lot of post-construction or post-project, post-species monitoring, because you have to be able to not only show that, one, there's an impact, you have to be able to define what that impact is and how it's going to affect your resource. And then you have to be able to show how that effect is being compensated for. So this is a long-term process. It's not something that you just come in and you sit down with and you're like, hey, I'm going to do this project in 6 months. Help me out. This is like, hey, I'm thinking about having or issuing or bidding on a lease in this area. Fish and Wildlife Service, what do you know? And what do you don't know? That's the kind of conversations you should be having. The earlier in the process you're having those conversations, the more streamlined the consultation process is. If you wait till the very end, then we are all at the mitigation or compensatory mitigation phase instead of the avoid and minimize. And I think it's really important because I've got several migratory bird counterparts in sitting over here, hi y'all, to mention that a lot of times, especially in the BOEM process, they are looking at ESA listed species. We are not considering, in a lot of areas, what is happening to our non-listed species. So even though the body of evidence and data for our roseate terns, our piping plovers, and our roof of red knots is growing, there are other species that could potentially just be as impacted just as much, but are not getting a close look. And those are the types of species that where we don't really have a lot of evidence or a lot of knowledge and a lot of data tracking studies, that it's really fantastic when industry partners come voluntarily to us and they say, not only are we interested in our listed species, we're also interested in doing something for our non-listed species, because when you're looking at a landscape scale approach for compensatory mitigation or conservation, habitats, any of these things, you really need to be looking at it holistically. All right, and this is what we're analyzing when we're looking at our consultations. So the effects on the species group. Are they avoiding the wind energy area? Are they, and by the way, most of this is hypothetical because the only ones that we have to look at are Block Island and Seavow off the coast of Virginia, which only has 2 turbines. So the pool that we can look and gather data from is pretty small, right? It's not going to be until Vineyard Wind and a lot of these other bigger projects are up that we're really going to be able to do post-construction monitoring and post-construction studies to really figure out what's happening there. And then when you've got 100 turbines, 500 turbines, 3,000 turbines, you know, what does that look like? How are the species being impacted cumulatively? Industry is going to play a really big role for us in figuring out what that answer is, and then helping us kind of assess the damage and mitigate and compensate for it. But for an ESA consultation, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at avoidance, we're looking at displacement, altered habitat use, the collision, and the cumulative population level effects. When, and the species that we're specifically looking at for the most part, listed and non-listed, is marine birds, shorebirds, land birds, and then obviously, you know, our roseate terns, our piping plovers, and our roof of red nuts. Those are our listed ones. We don't have a hard look at bats because bats, for the most part, don't necessarily travel into the offshore environment. However, they do island hop. So there's a big gap for us on what are the bats doing, how are they utilizing this space. When they're migrating, they're not generally calling is what we found. So how do you study that? And industry, as they continue to improve the technology, as they continue to put out new studies and to fund new research, they're helping us fill those gaps. So for us, if you are interested in having these types of conversations, if you're interested in learning more about the Fish and Wildlife Service's compensatory mitigation, or what kind of research is out there, or what kind of studies need to be implemented for our non-listed or our ESA-listed birds or bats, these are some of the folks that you can reach out to. I wanted to make sure that everybody had a resource available so that, you know, at the end, when, you know, you think about this a week from now or a month from now, you can be like, oh, hey, I'd like to have that conversation about this. These are the folks that you can reach out to. These are all regional contacts. So me, Christine Willis, she's actually out of Region 4. So basically the Carolinas and down is the projects that she's handling. Catherine Matthews, also Region 4, so Carolinas and down. And then our migratory bird team, they're all here. So you guys want to wave? Let them know who you are. So Scott Johnson, Pamela Loring, and Caleb Spiegel, the super team. And then our national wildlife refuges, which have our Class 1 airsheds and our wilderness areas. And for anybody who's not aware, we do have several Class 1 airsheds along the Atlantic coast. Basically, it's a special area. They have increased air quality standards than just the normal air quality that's out there. You're supposed to be working towards pre-industrial limits on them. So industry, when they are having those types of conversations, they're not just consulting for the EPA permit, they're also, the EPA is coming to the Fish and Wildlife Service and saying, hey, there's a refuge out here and there's gonna be some air quality impacts. You know, how do we address them? Like how are we gonna be able to all kind of work together to mitigate or offset, potentially, these impacts? So that's all I had.
All right, next we will have Grover to talk about CZMA in offshore wind.
Good afternoon, everybody. I guess I'm the old guy on the panel here. I've been involved in offshore wind for approximately 20 years now, so been around. The Block Island project was my baby. I was responsible for the planning, permitting, leasing, construction oversight, and then operational oversight of that project. Whoops, if I can go back. There we go. So I've been asked to talk about the state's ability to get involved in this discussion. The states obviously have the most direct interest in these areas, often know more about these areas than any other entities involved in the process, and hence have a very vested interest in what's going on. Most of these projects obviously are occurring in federal waters, and there's a limited ability for the state really to play in federal waters and get involved in these decisions. One of the major pieces of legislation that's out there that allows that is the Coastal Zone Management Act. And there are virtually all the states have approved programs now except for Alaska. And it's a very, very powerful tool for the states to use if they know how to use it right and plan it carefully. It runs off what's called an effects test. So this is different than NEPA. It's a different burden and runs off what is called foreseeable effects, reasonably foreseeable effects of impacts onto the coastal resources of the state, and also runs off enforceable policies of the state. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because the state, in developing those enforceable policies, also has to seek NOAA's approval of those policies going forward, and NOAA scrutinize those enforceable policies fairly regularly these days. So what are the federal actions that require CZMA review? And these are the projects. And offshore wind actually falls in categories D and E. And the burdens can differ depending on the body that's going forward. But when we think of it, the federal government, for instance, is held to a lower standard, if you want, than a private entity going forward. The federal government was given some leeway in terms of adhering to a state's coastal zone management program to the practical extent possible, whereas private entities have to be consistent, period, with the program. And so states can use this tool to reach out and play in federal waters, if you want, to help bring their concerns and resources to bear on these projects. So enforceable policies, this is just a definition of it, and giving credit, these are all NOAA slides, by the way. But it is something that has to have a fairly measurable standard that an applicant can compare themselves to. So it can't be a very open-ended statement. And hence these projects, and I'll show you some enforceable policies here, have to be fairly stringent in terms of their implementation. So typically, if we look at how a state would get consistency review, there is the unlisted review, meaning that the state hasn't necessarily gone forward and formed what's called a geographic location description. The project, at the state's first opportunity, knowing of that project, would reach out to NOAA and then seek their approval to be able to review that project. And in doing that, they would have to document what the potential impacts might be, reasonable foreseeable effects, and what the coastal resources are that would be impacted by that. So it requires still a fair amount of site information, some knowledge about the resources, and what those potential impacts might be. And you have to remember that on an unlisted review, you're under a deadline to produce that request fairly rapidly. And if you haven't thought about these issues and developed that database, you could be caught short in that issue. There are voluntary submittals, so an applicant or a company could voluntarily submit for consistency review, and then it would be captured under the state's program. Or the states can develop what are called geographic location descriptions, and there's a definition of a geographic description at the bottom of that page there. The geographic location descriptions, and I'm just going to show you Rhode Island's, are a way of setting out an area where the state has identified there are potential coastal resources that could be impacted, and it has to list those and be fairly definitive about that. And then it can exercise their enforceable policy. So if you want to think of this, federal consistency is really sort of a two-step process. You, one, have to be able to capture a project, but once you capture a project, you have to have something to measure the impacts against, and those are your enforceable policies. And so those really have to be developed up front before you really start to exercise this authority. And it becomes very important, particularly once you have a GLD, to look at this. So the pink area was actually developed, and we had a lot of data going into that from the Ocean Special Area Management Plan, which was a marine special plan developed by the state for that area. And the gray area was actually another area that was sought afterwards, but does encompass a lot of the Vineyard Wind area. And most of these are, and they were built off a lot of fishery data. Fisheries are one of the areas that there's a lot of spatial data on, and easy to build, not easy, but easier to build a GLD request off of. That request goes into NOAA. They seek input from other federal agencies, but ultimately NOAA renders a decision whether to give you that GLD or not. So some of our policies, and these are our enforceable policies here, that the council would use, and you can see that the council, through its permitting enforcement authorities in state waters, is sort of our premier authority that we use, but in federal waters, it would require the applicant essentially to be held to the same standard. And a lot of this was for the protection of the fishery itself. And you can see from these policies here that there's a large focus on that particular issue. And we talk about negotiation of mitigation agreements shall be necessary for the condition of an approval. Once the council's reviewed that project against its enforceable policies, it either, depending on whether we're doing it for the federal government or a private applicant, issues a determination or certification. The thing is that if we are giving a certification, for example, once we make that determination and it's in favor of the applicant, we've lost the ability to enforce it beyond that. Because once you make that consistency determination, you've essentially released the project out of your control and it's gone. So there are some sort of drawbacks to consistency. And in developing these policies and GLDs, they require a fair amount of information and a fair amount of thought by the state and should be done in advance of seeing these projects, not waiting for a project to appear because by then it's too late. You've lost the opportunity. And so I think it's very important. We've had a lot of discussions with our New England counterparts on this issue, trying to emphasize that point, but there's still a lot out there that I think are considering all this. The one thing that I want to point out, and this is sort of after a lot of years of looking at this issue and dealing with it, is that, and I want to emphasize this, the scale of the deployment that we're about to see has never occurred, particularly from, say, the mid-Atlantic up. Gulf of Mexico, yeah, they've got a lot of structures in the water. But the scale of deployment that we're about to see has never been done before. It's a grand experiment, and we don't know what we're doing. And there's concerns, I think, because the process is limited in its ability to deal with some of those impacts. NEPA was transformational in the way that government would look at projects in the 1970s. And it certainly has improved our decision-making tremendously, but NEPA is not without its own issues. And one of the problems that I think we have are both institutional and also legal from the NEPA standpoint in terms of these projects. So once a record of decision or ROD is issued, that ROD, from a practical standpoint, is pretty much set in concrete. You're not going to want to see an applicant go back and change that because it means sometimes going back through the entire NEPA review process to get back to the end. I think if we look at Cape Wind, for those that can remember that project, is sort of illustrative of that issue because in Cape Wind, by the time they got the ROD, technology had changed so much that the project was actually obsolete. But they refused to go back and change any of it because they didn't want to revisit the NEPA process through which they had years of litigation on. So there's a problem there in that we're scaling up these projects. We don't know what we're doing. Hopefully, we've captured most of the major impacts. And we don't see, well, I didn't see that one coming, because our ability to deal with it is going to be very limited. I think BOEM, if they were thinking about this a little harder, might look at the leasing process, because they have a lot more flexibility, I think, in the leasing process to incorporate lookbacks. We're essentially going to have a lot of the southern New England area permitted by the time these projects are getting built. And as I said, well, just think about this. The piles that they're using are larger than the ones they're using in Europe right now. The largest hammer they have in Europe to drive piles is called Thor's hammer. That'll give you an idea. It's a 40-foot diameter pile in a lot of instances. And the hammer has to be specially built to deal with that. So just think about that, because the 40-foot hammer is about from the back of that wall to the front of this desk. That's how big the pile is. The acoustic energy coming off that is immense. And it's operating 7 days, 24 hours, 2 of them in the field at one time. And we have 2 of those projects that will probably be going in construction during the same period. At the time, we were dealing with the best available technology for dealing with acoustic impacts, which within the range, a certain range of that pile, are lethal, was bubble curtains. So this is really, we're going to be figuring this out on the run. So I think in terms of adaptive management, I think that's where we really need to focus. You have to understand that regulatory programs, as had already been indicated, are built off the concept do no harm. We don't tend to think about, or are not really set up to think about enhancement of those projects. But I think we have to get even back to a state where we're looking at adaptive management and being able to deal with those projects as they're under construction. So with that, thank you.
To get us started, I've got a couple questions I'll start with, and then, like I said, open it up for audience Q&A. And I was thinking maybe I'd start on sort of the, going sort of chronologically, just at the early phase of offshore wind development. Are there things that, and I know there's been some examples given, but are there things that can be done differently under our existing framework or done perhaps better than what is allowed for under our existing framework to help with the biodiversity issue and help get us to a place where we might be able to accomplish net positive impacts? So I'll open it up, I guess. Anyone jump in? Ted, feel free to jump in as well. Any thoughts?
I think there's a couple of things, but when we were working on it, we had built in options to look back on the project and make adjustments as we were going on. And as I said, I think that's important to try to build into the process somehow. And also maybe even open opportunities for some of this net positive impact if we're looking at projects that have gained that, maybe to build some of that back in, if particularly we're having a negative impact. The other thing that's, again, within the state's ability to, I think, enhance some of this process is through the procurement phase when they're actually going out for the RFPs for wind projects. The states can incorporate within those RFPs certain criteria and guidelines that they'd like to see bidders that are going to bid to get the contracts with the state. And so I think that's another opportunity for this process to enhance itself. So.
Great.
Yeah, I sort of spoke to some of this, during my talks. I don't want to be too repetitive, but I think really identifying impacts throughout the entire life cycle of offshore development to the extent possible, and of course it's not possible to foresee and predict everything, but to the extent that early identification of impacts and potential changes to ecosystems can be identified, I think that really needs to be built into the process to a greater extent.
I guess maybe I'll add something too. I think you heard themes throughout each of these talks, and I just tried to set it up a little bit in my opening. Is I think these things are all connected. So when we say we need to adaptively manage, that there are data gaps out there, that we still have questions. If we're to get to biodiversity positive in some of these projects that we're, some of these concepts that we're thinking about, it's how do you, we have to work on those as well. And so thinking about, are there opportunities early on to require regional research and engagement with the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative? Are there opportunities to drive, upfront data sharing that help us get at some of these questions? I think these are things that would help the planning process. They would help adaptive management along the way, and I see them as all interconnected.
If I could add on to that. I think the NEPA process ultimately is supposed to be sort of an environmental collaboration and conflict resolution process, and it really does depend on a fair amount of transparency outside of just the formalities of public notices and comments on documents. And it really does, along the lines of what Stephanie was talking about with regard to consultations. It really does depend on good management of the issues and collaboration, and that's work. That's when you're an agency of limited resources and you're kind of under the gun and you just want to kind of go behind closed doors and work on your document. Well, there's no time to do that kind of work, and so frankly, taking some risks and being collaborative and trying to figure out these solutions. I think as Grover noted, this is a grand experiment, and decisions are being made without perfect foresight. I mean, it's why we do a forecasting approach, and we do our level best. Ultimately, it's a process of informed decision-making based on best available information, and recognizing that we're going to learn as we go along, and providing for that, and the mechanisms to adjust, adapt, and consistent with the practicalities of this is also a major investment, and investors need to have some certainty that they can actually stand up all the infrastructure it takes to actually build these projects.
Yeah, and so for future leasing areas, right now the Gulf of Maine is in the planning phase. I think it would benefit industry and conservation groups just in general to really take a look at the modeling that's being done to site these leases, to site the areas where potential leases could occur. If you're really trying to do net benefit, well then we have to first analyze what the potential impact is. We have to know what the baseline of your populations are, not just the listed species either. So work with your federal agencies, work with your state partners before you go out and put a bid in there, and say, where are the highest risk areas and how can I avoid them? How can I make sure that that's not even a part, it's not even a spot for consideration for leasing, right? Because there are areas that are so deconflicted that the risk is truly low. But that requires going to your partners very early on, before you put your bid in, before you have a lease area up, and saying, out of this whole area, where can I really find a spot that is not going to be an issue for my ESA or my non-listed species? And that requires some serious forward thinking. It's not just going in and looking at an opportunity, it's going in and saying, how am I going to do my best work here? How can I have a net positive impact? Well, I think the best way to do it is to just not have the impact from the get-go. Just work from the baseline of, I've got 20 birds, and I'm not going to lose any of them. I'm going to site this in such a great site. I'm going to work with all of my partners to really address the issues ahead of the plan or ahead of the process, and then I'm going to implement long-term projects with consistent monitoring that's going to get me from a baseline of 20 birds, right, to 40 birds, and now I'm recovered, or whatever it is that you're looking for to get. But I think it's really important that when you're looking at net positive impacts, you're really addressing, what the effect of that impact is going to be.
My next question for our esteemed panelists is, and we've talked about this a little bit, but it relates to adaptive management. And I guess my question is, kind of now looking ahead in the development process, when you're at the stage of actual construction, let's say something comes up that is a bit of a surprise. Are there ways to adapt under our existing framework to mitigate those surprises? And also going forward, on the operational front, let's say you're 10 years down the road and we're realizing there's some, maybe negative impacts that weren't accounted for early on or were unknowns. Are there things under our current framework to address those types of issues, or ways that the current framework needs maybe to be modified to help better facilitate adaptive management? In 1 minute or less. No.
So here's a novel concept. BOEM requires all this site identification work, primarily for geotechnical, geophysical, for construction of towers. They also will require a lot of it for Section 106 archaeological resources. There's no requirements built in for baseline conditions for the natural environment. And we've been after BOEM for years, but they've resisted getting that baseline data. That's what you need to begin with to start this adaptive management, because you don't know what you've done if you didn't know what the environment looked like in the first place. So that's part of it. The other thing that I think is going to be an institutional challenge, and I don't think anybody's really thought about this or considered it yet. Once that tower is constructed and the field's constructed, BOEM turns it over to Bessie. And Bessie's focus is on safety and operation, not so much looking at the environment and what just happened over the last 10 years. So how does that look back occur, and who takes responsibility for that look back, and how does it happen, I think is another major consideration that has to happen.
Yeah, and another sort of challenge in implementing adaptive management is that often, or I think usually adaptive management programs rely on having pre-established triggers that bring you back to the drawing board and like reconsider the type of management you're doing. So I think onshore, for example, if there are certain bird fatalities or things like that, that puts you into this, back into this sort of iterative decision-making adaptive management process. And I think offshore monitoring is really difficult. And so this ongoing monitoring, having technologies for that, having enforceable rules around that is going to be a really critical challenge around implementing adaptive management.
So I think at this point, why don't we open it up for audience Q&A, and if we have any pauses, I have more questions to ask. Thanks.
So just as a reminder, we have our students who are going to come and bring microphones to you. So please raise your hand if you have a question.
Thanks for all the great summary of the current conditions, et cetera, and thoughts. It was mentioned one thing, we don't understand our base conditions very well. We have a lot of questions we're not presently able to answer, and we only have 7 turbines in the water. My question is, whose responsibility is it to try and make sure we do everything in the most responsible way? I've heard a number of comments saying it's, well, the developer should A, B, and C. I'm not a developer, but in my conversations with developers, I've heard the thought expressed that, guess what? There's been billions of dollars that have been spent on, through the lease sales. Other countries around the world, and I know we have great Netherlands representation here, they've been very thoughtful in gathering their own data and making their own public assessment. We know there is the RISE Act right now that Congress, or I should say a senator from Louisiana has introduced, similar to the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, to take a portion of those lease sales so that we can actually learn about our environment and assess the impact of the installations. So my question is this something that we should be trying to force developers to collect certain information, or is this actually in the public responsibility and the resources have been given to the government to take responsibility for this in a similar way as we've seen happen in Europe?
You want me? I think both. In the ocean sand process, one of the things we were given the task was to look at the area and consider where the potential for offshore wind had its greatest probability getting through the process without with the least amount of impact to those resources. And so we started out with a very large area and narrowed that area down based on that. And I think, the government has a responsibility to go out before they issue these calls on wind energy areas to make sure the wind energy area doesn't have a lot of these no-go zones, basically. Because the developer, when they bid on that area, is sort of under the impression, if you want, maybe not anymore, but under the impression that, well, all this is developable. I can utilize the entire block, and it's not. There are many areas within that block that have limitations on it, and that play out in the process. To the extent that that could be winnowed out, I think that would be great. But the other thing is that there's still baseline data that needs to be gathered on some pretty basic areas that remain. And I don't see any problem with putting that burden back on the developer, because, as I said, they're spending millions of dollars collecting information for site characterizations, for geotechnical, geophysical, and archaeological. And just some extra dollars spent on the environmental side would go a long way, I think, to helping speed the reviews, because regulators are risk averse. They don't want to make a decision that will come back to haunt them. And what speeds that process up is knowledge. And if they have knowledge that the risk is reduced because these areas are already deconflicted, they can make those decisions a lot quicker. So,
maybe I can add something. I think the reality, it's got to be coordinated in some way. I think you're going to have, the federal government, which we know many of the agencies that are doing this work are severely underfunded, and we're not funding them at the level they need to do basic surveys. There are fishery surveys that haven't been done in years that need funding. You've got universities doing work, you have developers doing work, and there's, I keep coming back to Emily, and maybe I should have just put her up here for the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, but that's an effort of trying to sort of sort those and say, okay, universities doing this, the federal government's doing this, developers are doing this, what are those data gaps, and how do we get resources to fill those? And I think that's just sort of the reality that we're working in, but we've got to figure out a way to coordinate that, to create data standards, to share that publicly, or part of this experience, we're not going to have the data to make informed decisions.
Hi, this is Jen McCann from URI. Grover, I have a question for you. You mentioned lookbacks. Can you give a little bit more? What do you mean by that? And how would we implement that?
Well, the concept of lookbacks is you can either use a temporal measure with that, or as somebody suggested, trigger points. So if you see a significant mortality in something, you can stop and say, what's causing this? Is it related to the project, or is it something else? And then if it is project related, how do we make adjustments to ensure that this doesn't keep occurring going forward? As I said, though, the issue is you've got all these approvals that are going to be lined up. And if we discover this on project one, how do we affect the change all the way through the system down to the projects that haven't yet started construction? So, are these enforceable? Depends on how they're structured, but yes, I think they're enforceable. Yeah.
Is this on? Yes. My question, I'm very interested in the concept of provisions on auctions. And this came up during discussion during the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network. We're talking about the auction and the provision that was suggested for fisheries on compensation. And was wondering if you could provide some examples that may be used for other wildlife. Thinking, for example, with birds, that take has not yet been estimated. So what might be acceptable forms of provisions related to birds, for example, in lease auctions?
Can you ask that question again?
Like in the multi-factor bidding component? I guess that's the...
Yeah, so the question has to do with the credit-based theme to putting provisions on the lease auction and how that might be set up when take has not yet been established. I'm talking about here, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So I think maybe the Atlantic is a little further along, but when thinking about future lease auctions and what might be used as example provisions that it could incorporate a credit-based approach considering take.
And I think it would depend on sort of what specific strategies would help work towards net positive impacts for birds. So I can't speak exactly to sort of avian-based strategies. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Stephanie.
Okay, yeah, so I have some thoughts. All right. The first one is that on the Atlantic, we're utilizing modeling to establish or estimate take. So I think it would be important for any future lease areas to not only utilize models that are available, but to also improve them, to take that time to improve them. I think that's an important thing that everybody should be working towards, is saying, you know, what are the biases, where are the holes, where are the data gaps, and improving them so that when you're estimating future take at a lease area, you're being appropriate, right? You don't want to overestimate, and you don't want to really underestimate either. You want to try and be as close as you possibly can. And so for provisions, I suppose I would make sure that that would be right in there from the very beginning. You got to do some kind of tracking studies. You got to do some kind of monitoring. You know, there should be like a baseline that you have to do and you have to make that commitment to. When you look at mitigation now, and because this is all future planning, you know, you have to base that mitigation on how to benefit the resource, which means you have to have a pretty good understanding of what the impact is going to be to the resource. That all takes time and planning. And so for any kind of avian or bat, you know, it's going to be basically, you have to do studies to really kind of figure out what the effects are going to be if something happens in the population. So for future lease areas, yeah, there should definitely be provisions in there for studies. As far as like credits and conservation, you can't set that up until you know what the effect is going to be on the population. So that has to all be established. If you have you can really only establish that if you have a pretty good understanding of what the effect is.
Yeah, I mean, that being said, I think I totally agree with all that. There are ways you could design credits that are forward-looking. You could have sort of binding commitments to take actions that will be sort of identified in the future. You could potentially put some sort of monetary value on how much you'll be contributing to those future actions, even if you haven't yet identified them. So if your question kind of relates to maybe the time disconnect, I think you could design a non-monetary factor that would basically be a binding commitment to take future actions.
Hi, this is Marty Hines. I'm with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We've got a panel on that tomorrow, and I'm speaking on bidding credits and auction, so that might be more appropriate for one of tomorrow's plenary sessions. But I do have one more comment. BOEM actually is funding a lot of studies right now. Specifically for Block Island, Rhode Island, there's an ongoing study that looks at the impacts around those 5 turbines, the rodeo study. Developers are doing surveys right now from when they lease. I saw some of the developers on the list of attendees here. I don't know if they want to share what they're doing, but I guess I just want to counter the impression that there is baseline data being collected. There is analysis of the Block Island project that looks at the impacts and look at what is happening on other sites that don't have those type of impacts. So just want to add that.
Hello, Lola Herrera, Technical University of Delft in Netherlands. I think it was Grover that said that in the procurement process can be something that it can incorporate opportunities for enhancement. Can you give us an example, for example, how could you do it and how that can influence the process that is already the lease that BOEM is giving as well?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's something that is a forward-looking commitment that would be made by the developer should they be the successful applicant for a bid for the state power purchase. And so it would have to be based on their assessment of the area and the risks that might be there and what commitments they're willing to make as part of that process for the various environmental and use aspects within that area. We haven't discussed much about fisheries, for instance, but dealing with the fishermen and their concerns and compensation that may be made is one aspect of that could be made. And there are other environmental ones, but they're future related because usually at the procurement phase, they haven't been the successful bidder on the lease. So they haven't have a lease in hand essentially to make those obligations real until they go forward. And then there would have to be enforcement mechanisms that if the developer ever reneged on those, it would potentially invalidate the bid. So those are the ways that a state could structure the process to make it, more open, I think, for some of these things, rather than, as a lot of states do right now, strictly on the cost basis.
And I have to be the heavy and say that we don't have any more time right now. We want to keep to schedule. You do have a half an hour for a break, so please join me in thanking our first panel.
Thank you.